So, Paula, it's wonderful being here in person with you today. Over the course of the book, we had a lot of phone calls and video calls, but it's a different thing to be here in person. So, I'd love to give you the opportunity to read a bit of your book before we actually start discussing the process of writing it.
Okay. Thanks, Shayna. I'm really happy you're here and that I got to physically touch you. That sounds weird. Yeah, and it's great to be here. It definitely feels like coming home, and I loved my time here at Berkeley. I love that Underground Scholars is co-sponsoring. Shout out to Underground Scholars. They have organizations in a lot of campuses, especially in California. Definitely check them out if you have not already. So I'm going to read a small bit that I think works for this audience. I'm not sure, but we'll find out. So this is from the preface. When I first wrote this book, I omitted myself completely. In workshopping some sample chapters, however, there was a natural curiosity about who I was and how I came to cross paths with the people in this book. To that end, there are some stories about my journey to and around the modern civil rights movement early on. But as we enter the heart of the book, the chapters profiling the movement architects, these personal anecdotes fade away. My voice appears as a guide throughout, but my goal is to amplify the voices of others, not to speak for them or over them. Consider me an access point, a conduit into worlds you may otherwise not be aware of or exposed to. I will be your eyes and ears in the rooms of revolution, but I do not presume to own the messages that emanate from them. The ideas, plans, and theories contained in this volume are presented through the lens of those most directly impacted by systems of oppression. All the conversations detailed here regarding those ideas were consensually held, and each person represented has agreed to be portrayed. It is their up-close and personal encounters with the systems they are in conflict with that have informed their solutions. It is their willingness to have their stories told that allowed this book to happen. Thank you.
I think that's a perfect starting passage, Paula, and it really kind of sets the frame for the whole conversation we're going to have today. But first, we're going to start with a recent article that you were quoted in. You were interviewed by the SF Chronicle, and you mentioned in those recent pieces, you were featured in 2 pieces by the SF Chronicle. You mentioned there that you don't actually expend that much energy in politics because you want to make sure you have space left over for social movements. Can you talk a little bit about how you view politics and movements as diverging from each other, and how that informed the writing of your book?
Sure. So I'm a big fan of one of the things that I've come to espouse is that I don't look for political solutions to societal problems. To me, political advancement is an individual advancement. Having worked for a politician who now works up the street, versus a social movement, which is about community uplift and community survival. I think one of the things that is revolutionary these days is the idea of taking care of each other. We live in a sort of dog-eat-dog competitive environment. And I think politics is a perfect example of that. And for me, the solution is not going to come from, someone who is focusing on gaining power and then retaining power. It's going to come from boots on the ground, people who have real conversations. I had a great conversation with Mohammed Sheikh last night from Critical Resistance, and one of the things he says is we don't helicopter in solutions. So they want to close this prison in Susanville. They're not going to tell Susanville what to do next. They're going and they're having conversations with the people who live there and about what their economy needs and where the resources from that prison would have gone to. And as many town halls as you can pull off as a politician, I don't think they get to have those conversations. So I believe in voting, but in terms of investing my energy and time, I don't want to get to the end of an election season and then just go oh my God, that was such a dumpster fire, I give up. I want to go to work for a better future the next day also.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that aligns with why you published this book with North Atlantic Books. I didn't mention I'm the Associate Acquisitions Director at North Atlantic Books. And we're really focused on systems change, right? As you said, taking care of each other is tantamount to doing systems change work. So from your perspective, how does journalism, how does reporting fit into systems change work in the long run?
Sure. I think there's a couple answers. The first that I sort of alluded to in the reading, which is that we are the access point to places where people can't get in the door. You get a press pass. I remember I actually started in journalism. I wanted to write novels, but I got into journalism because I went to Duke undergrad and I didn't want to wait in line for basketball tickets. So I got a press pass. Got to sit in front row without having to wait. And but it was like an early seed that this is a way to get through doors, and then to tell people who aren't allowed in those doors, which arguably shouldn't be erected anyway, to take them in with you and to report back. And that's what reporting is. You report back what you see inside. And so I think that's where I think a lot of journalism come in, is to just be eyes and ears for people who aren't up close with the situation. The other thing I think is that at its core, journalism is about asking questions, which I think is the only way to like really have a dialogue. I think with the technological revolution and having the world at your fingertips on your phone, and then 24-hour news cycles, which are becoming progressively more prescriptive and analytical and speculative, you have a sense that we already know everything. And I think a really humbling part of being a journalist, and a great part about being the journalist, is that I get to have conversations with people because I know enough to talk with them, but I haven't stopped asking questions. And I think that just in life, not as a journalist, but just as a person, I think it's a good way to have a dialogue, is to ask questions and stay curious.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think asking questions, staying curious, showing up with empathy is not only core to journalism, but is also core to doing this community-focused work. And one thing I want to ask you is, you've been a journalist for many, many years now. And journalism is often writing shorter pieces, right? Working on a tight deadline, working with your source and really trying to get someone else's voice out. So for you, what was the biggest difference between reporting and writing a full-length book? Big question.
Yeah. Well, so I got an advanced copy of the book, and I remember my reaction when it came in the mail was like, where's the rest of the book? Because I had felt like I had written an encyclopedia. Because I'm used to writing these short bylines. And right before I started writing the book, I was, my last job in journalism, I was an investigative reporter in criminal justice. And so I was already, I like to really research. So that part didn't change. I just got to have a little bit more time because I had to write most of the book before I talked to you. And so I got to do more research, but I think more than that, I hadn't realized that I had spent a lot of time in journalism, and I had kind of trained myself to adhere to whatever that publication's voice or style guides dictated. And a lot of that became sort of cookie cutter and automated. And maybe I had to get like a little leniency to like flourish the lead. But when I wrote this book, I realized that I really had to remember how to tell a story. And for me, that story was found in the humanity of people, which also differed from kind of my approach to journalism. It's about the things. And this was about people and their lives and storytelling. And so I really had to expand my, I had to go back to learning how to tell a story.
Yeah, I think one of the things I loved most about working on this book with you is learning about all of the individuals that were profiled in every chapter. You're learning not just what is the single activist uh, instant that they're working on, but who are they? What brought them to this work? What are they thinking about each day? And you brought yourself into this book as well. And as you alluded to in the passage that you read, that wasn't necessarily your intention. What was that like, including parts of yourself in this book, especially when your goal was to uplift the voices of other people?
Yeah, it was difficult, especially because as journalists we're not in the story, right? So, but for me, the story quickly became about not about politics and not about social movements. It became about people and about humanity. And in order to do that, I had to become very, like, I have close friendships with most of the people in the book now. To like sit down and have an open and honest conversation about that, especially as someone who, like, I've done grassroots organizing in Black liberation movements, but like clearly, you know, like, so like there needs to be a trust, there needs to be an acknowledgement that someone who is not directly impacted is writing this book, but I'm going to get as close as I can to the heart of this story, to sort of try to tell stories that aren't getting out there. You know, for me, the biggest things in the book were, for me, I'm proud of the incarcerated activists and artists that are in the book, because I think that that's a situation where, unfortunately, I have to be the conduit. You know, they are in a system that is designed to not allow them a voice, to not allow them public. I mean, Ivan's written 4 books, but you read about him in mine. You know, like that's just the way it's kind of set up. And I don't like that, but I'll do what I can to sort of get his voice in the halls of power because he has a story to tell and he has an idea. And he is strong enough to try to improve a society that has told him they want nothing to do with him and they lock him up and throw away the key. So I felt it necessary to step in to make the readers and give them give readers a really intimate portrait of these people, because 1, I think their lives and their ideas are interesting, but 2, they are amazing people.
Yeah, originally I had a question, and I'm just going to turn this into a statement. Okay. It's impossible to do journalism, to write a book without a bias. And I think what you're expressing here to an extent is you have to be intentional about what bias you're bringing to the page. Mm-hmm. The bias you're bringing here is I want to be the conduit and make sure that the stories I'm telling are as true to the original voices that are sharing those stories, so we can look at them and reflect on them as truly as possible.
Yeah, and I do, and I mean, I don't want to. I think it's important to challenge. I mean, when I talk about asking questions, there's a chapter in the book about reimagining capitalism, and the model is based on capitalist principles, and it's a problem chapter with a lot of people. It comes right after the chapter with Angela Davis, who like says capitalism is going to be the end of all times. And so in that chapter, I challenged Mike, Killer Mike, and Ambassador Andrew Young, and I said, and I just laid that out. I said, capitalism has, been sort of anti-revolution and pro, human exploitation. How do you justify that? And for me, where I take myself out of it is not excluding them from the book. So not saying like, well, you don't align with my opinion, majority opinion, so I don't really want to tell your story anymore. Mine is just saying like, these are the problems with it. This is their answer to it, and that's sort of how I moved it forward.
So you mentioned in this last answer, Angela Davis. You mentioned working with Mike Render or Killer Mike. How did you gain access to some of these folks with really high profiles, well-known names? I mean, Ilyasah Shabazz, the daughter of Malcolm X, wrote a fantastic foreword for this book. How did you go about forming these relationships?
Sure. Shout out to my girl Ilyasah. I love her. So a lot of them were, so like Angela Davis, for example, that's from just doing the work, from being embedded in these groups, and knowing people and talking to people. And I think having some skin in the game earned me a lot of credibility. I think that it is, so to back up for a second. So I was hired by All of Us or None, which is a grassroots organization down here in Oakland, to write a newspaper. And that newspaper now goes into all the California prisons and several prisons across the country. But in doing that, again, not wanting to insert myself, I tried to fill it mostly with bylines from incarcerated writers or formerly incarcerated writers. The ones that I wrote were kind of profiles of people who were out, what their return home was like, and what they're doing now. And then I wrote about some legislations as well. And so doing that work helped earn me some credibility because, one, I was doing the work. There's only like one way to do it. Two, I had gone from being kind of a jack of all trades general assignment reporter to being a very specific beat reporter, and being able to converse with people with a knowledge of, with a deep knowledge of what you're talking about goes a long way. Like, it was one thing when I would talk to people about, how I read Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis. It's another thing to talk to people about White Skin, White Mass by Frantz Fanon. Black Skin, White Mass by Frantz Fanon. So, so I think that earned me some credibility. The other thing is that I'll do that one last. But another thing is I know how much burnout and how much time and energy it takes to fight in a decades-long fight for centuries long fight for peace and equality. I know that, like, to be in that environment means there's something new every day to be outraged about and to focus on. And I know all the kind of moving parts that are going on in the fight for justice. And so I was very respectful and open about people's time. So I did as much research as I could before I actually talked to anybody. So that I really could ask them, like with Mike, he gave me a half hour. And so I went through and I watched all of his old interviews, and I saw that in a half hour, he on average answered 2 questions, because the man likes to talk. And so, so I was like, okay, if I only have 2 questions, what am I gonna ask him? And how can I fill in the rest? And so that's what I did, and I got exactly 2 questions. And so that was, a part of it. It was just being respectful of people's time and really focusing on the absolute important thing that they have to fill in. And then lastly, the thing about social justice movements is they're quite persistent. So no one could really fault me for for just following up and following up and following up. I think Ilyasah and I started talking right after you and I started talking, and she wrote the foreword in January. So it was just one of those things. I'm respectful of people's time. If they have the time, I'll do whatever I can to help them along, extend deadlines, do what I need to do. But I don't think, especially when you're covering social justice movements, anyone's ever going to follow you for being persistent.
I think your last point there also speaks to the writing process in general, at least in book publishing. We can set as many deadlines as we'd like to, and at the end of the day, if something isn't there, if we want it, we're going to wait for it. If we want the right words from the right person to come in, we have to wait for it.
Well, that would have been nice to know.
I mean, we also really want our deadlines to come in on time.
Yeah, I know.
So I feel like you addressed this to a certain extent in your previous answers, but most of the people you have been interviewing come from marginalized backgrounds. You've spoken with a lot of incarcerated activists. Most of the people you interviewed in the book are Black. You're coming from a very different positionality. You're a white woman from a different socioeconomic class than a lot of the people you've spoken with. What challenges did you and your interviewees encounter just navigating different parts of positionality?
So one of the things that, and I think I mentioned this before, was that I really came from a perspective of learning, a perspective of asking questions. Again, having that base knowledge and the sort of like deep understanding of history and of what has already been put out there, but still not having the answers. One of the things that has obviously come up a lot recently is that I'm Jewish and that I'm profile Black liberation movements, and that there is a close tie to Free Palestine, not a close tie, they are an intertwined struggle. And so what happened, one of the things that I think is a good example of how I navigate these relationships is that after October 7th, on October 8th, I wrote an email to Mohammed Sheikh over at Critical Resistance, I mentioned him before, and I said, hey, I want to talk. I want to understand this. I want to understand the connection. I want to understand where you guys are coming from. I want to understand like the appropriate way to engage here. And since then, I've taken a lot of information, but that's what I mean, is coming from a place of wanting to understand. And I think that like that's really where I think at the core, if you write a story about justice and equality, you're writing a story about humanity. And so I don't see myself that different from the people that I profile. Obviously, I have had the privilege of going to great institutions and writing a book and working for publications. But at our core, we believe in very similar things. We believe in taking care of each other. We believe in people's voices and people that speak in their own voices. We believe in equality, and I think those things made those relationships quite easy to navigate.
Right, and as you write several times throughout the book, the core goal, the core message of this book is liberation, is abolition, is kind of the forward movement of freedom led by the people who are most impacted. Mm-hmm. And to that end, I want to speak a little more specifically about relationships that you had with incarcerated activists. Specifically, I want to speak to how did you build and maintain relationships with Ivan Kilgore and Heshima Dunham, who are each featured very prominently in this book and are doing amazing work. Mm-hmm.
So Heshima was one of my writers when I wrote the newspaper for All of Us or None. And it was very quick. It's very obvious from his first essay that he is incredibly intelligent. And one of the things that I have found working with incarcerated writers, with incarcerated artists, which is where the standpoint I had come to before, like that was my kind of relationship with incarceration, was that I knew formerly incarcerated people and was communicating with people who are inside through their writing and through their art. And one of the things that became so obvious, and I don't know why it took me so long to understand, but like as the most incarcerated nation in human history, we lock up some real talent and real genius. You know, like there are people in there who have dedicated themselves to studying. You know, Ken Oliver, who I'm going to talk to tomorrow night at the Passages at SF Ferry Building, he gave himself, he became a paralegal. You know, I think that the minds and creativity that we lock up is just astounding. And so I wanted to know more about that. I wanted to know more about what drives a person who has been shunned by society to reach back out to that society and try to make it better. One of the things about, and so Hashima and I, we mostly wrote letters. Hashima, he was in the Pelican Bay Shoe, and so we become very. When it came to like the big interviews, we did phone calls, but I'm very protective of him, and because that is just like a whole nightmare. And then Ivan, I had mostly conversations with. He has a system because he has a nonprofit and he has internships for college students, and he has a system for like navigating how to be in touch with people on the outside, and so. I had sort of talked to him about that, but Ivan in particular, he's not getting out, and so he's forming. I mean, he's trying, and who knows what sort of legislation is going to come down the ballot, but like, he's trying to better a society he's not going to be part of. Like how, I guess I need to talk to that person. I need to talk to that person and figure out like what's going on, because I envy that. I envy, like, and I also think as someone, like prison art in particular, you're coming up with something beautiful in a place designed to take away all sense of beauty and humanity. And for me, I try to carry that into the world, just like when everything seems dark and maybe there's an election coming up and it's like a dumpster fire, that like, if you look for the beauty, if you find one beautiful thing or you see light at the end of the tunnel, you will keep moving forward. And so that's what I've tried to do is try to understand that perspective, professionally so that I could kind of explain it and show it because I think it's interesting, but personally because it's been a lifesaver.
Yeah, and this question was not prepped, but I want to focus a little more on the art in the book, because for me that was one of the most powerful things here, to see this visual depiction from, I believe there are 6 different artists there were 6 different images, 3 different artists who were featured, and each of the pieces of art are so different. We have a graphic novel style, we have portraiture, and then we have something based in cartoon drawing. And I'm wondering, why was it important to you to include art and the artist's depictions of the word in addition to this message for specific styles of systems change?
So I'm going to give 2 answers. One is a totally reasonable justification for why I did what I did. And the other is that I just love my guys. Like these artists and their hope and their work, it was overpowering. And I needed to bring them on this journey with me. I will say that 2 of them are no longer in prison, which is fantastic. Scotty is the only one who's still incarcerated. And the other reason, the real reason, is that when I worked for that newspaper, one of the things that they kind of hammered into us is that the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I couldn't get closer than prison. And so when we're talking about a prison abolition organization. So at the front page of the newspaper, I don't think it's like this anymore. I left back in 2021. The front page of the newspaper was a full-size image of prison art. And so it was almost like habit by the time I wrote the book to just have it introduced by prison art. And then, I went to my regular guys, which is Gerald Morgan and who's out here in Oakland now, and Scotty Scott. They have the majority of images in the book. Carnell Honeycutt is the other one. He has 1 image. We can get into that if you want, but but I just went to my boys and I said, I'm writing this book. I want you guys to be in it. I think people should know who you are. I think people should respect what you do. Because to me, you can go to Fisherman's Wharf and go to the art galleries, and being in a gallery provides value, I guess, for some people. For me, the idea of designing prison art is just, it's revolutionary in itself, but also I think like the human toll to be able to do that makes the value even more valuable. And I will say that I compensated all the artists. I had to do two commissary deposits because they limit how much you can send. But I think it's important that especially, in this day and age, you guys have a ballot measure coming up to take out the legal slavery exemption from the California state constitution, that they don't work for free anymore. So that was important to me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, commissary as one challenge to working directly with incarcerated people. And there were so many more things you mentioned, that Hashima Dunham was in the shoe, and that you were writing letters to each other. In the book, you talk about the way that Vice News compromised the security and safety of Ivan Kilgore early on in the pandemic. I'm wondering if you could talk about some additional obstacles that were faced when working with incarcerated activists, and how you navigated some of these challenges, and how you worked to maintain the safety of the people that you cared about and worked with.
Yeah. So I think that working with incarcerated individuals is very important. But as journalists, we're trained to protect sources. And the consequences of people who have already had the floor ripped out from under them are dire. So the Vice News example, people were starting to wonder about these COVID incubators called California prisons, and they were starting to get stories from inside. And someone contacted Ivan. At the time, he had a contraband cell phone, which is very common. And they blurred his face, but they did not disguise his voice. It was clear. They said what prison he was in, and he, at first, the guards tossed the cells of the people that, around him, and said that it was Ivan's fault, so that they would take care of the PR problem. Then they threatened to transfer him, and we did a bunch of, actually that's the first time I heard his name, was all of us or none filed an amicio on that. So the consequences are very real. That being said, I don't think, the other artist in the book is Carnell Honeycutt, and the consequences were so real for Carnell. He actually did a full graphic novel version of Race to Incarcerate. I only put the first page of that in the book. But he pitched, Mark Maurer, who wrote Race to Incarcerate, published a graphic novel version, but it was too hard to do it with Carnell, so they did it with someone on the outside. And so when I heard that, first of all, people who are already dedicated to this have a difficult time working with incarcerated populations. So it takes time. And I think that time is something we don't have a ton of in journalism. But in the background, to develop those relationships and to understand how prison works before you enter into these relationships is really important. One of the advents of California prisons now is that everyone is supposed to have a tablet, and so that you can communicate, text message. It is, again, all monitored. Everything is always monitored. But that is one way to have more messages go back and forth, or arrange times to call. When Ivan and I first started doing that, I just answered whatever time it was, whatever I was doing, because it's not like I can call back. And also, you know, he calls my husband too now. But, you know, it's one of those things where what I told James is that they already feel forgotten. So just pick up the phone, you know, just do what you can to remember, so that they know that they're not being forgotten. Did I answer the question?
I think you did, yeah. So to kind of wrap up this part of the conversation before we move into Q&A, I want to ask, how did writing this book, I guess, change your perspective, both on your role as a journalist, but also on what steps we need to take collectively as a society to move toward abolition, to move toward collective liberation, and especially to uplift Black liberation? What changed for you since you began writing and since the book is now here, published?
Sure. Many things, and I'm sure I'll lose myself in my thoughts again. But the first is that I was very concerned, and when I started writing the book, was I was disillusioned and a little bit in despair and hopeless because the whole, you know, we have, well, first of all, it was in 2020, so it was easy to get hopeless about everything. But, you know, I was working in an organization when Breonna Taylor was killed, when George Floyd was killed. I was researching horrific ways in which Black people were killed by police, and like the mind-boggling statistics behind that. We had a president at the time that I'm now having to deal with again, and you know, it seemed endless, and the whole idea behind social justice movements, and we were looking at the exact same, we were protesting the same issues they were protesting in the original civil rights movement. So I was like, what is the point? Like, what are we doing? And after the book, I have a lot more hope. One reason is that those political issues are short-lived. Let's, like, if you want to look at the president, we got a maximum of 8 years, and then, you know, the next 8 years, the other party undoes all that. And
Listen,
I want you to call them and ask them.
So can I call the third person?
But social justice movements have been
No, do it. Most
moving
libraries
forward since
No,
civil
most
rights
libraries
started.
let you print
You know,
it.
I have Angela Davis in my book, and she has been fighting since Black Panther Party. So I see that as
She's good, this kid.
hopeful. I think you can see it as,
Yeah.
like, well, when are we going to ever stop? But, like, the fact that the movement has kept moving for that long really made me feel a lot better about whatever outcome happens, you know, in our elections, or whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the news cycle breaks that is the catastrophe for that week. I know that people are going to show up to work tomorrow to try to make change, and that was very hopeful for me. I think the other thing that I learned is how many stories there are that aren't being told, and a deep sense of obligation to do that. And I think finally, I don't think I knew where my place was before, in the movement, before I wrote the book. I don't think that's uncommon for, like, a white person who's trying to just do the right thing. And I think that's why you have people show up as signs, because that seems to be the indicated thing to do. And so I wanted to know where my place in all this would be. And at the end, the people I worked with they gave me a place. They said, tell this story, read this book, you know. And it's just, for me, I've never really fit in. I was a tomboy who went to an all-girls school for 13 years. So it's actually a more comfortable place for me to be now. It's just kind of being an amplifier and wanting to tell stories that matter.
Thanks. Well, a lot of what you shared in that last answer really resonates deeply with me. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's important to tell the stories of people who might have a challenge reaching the microphone, continue moving forward in a movement, because as we can't stop at a single moment, and maintain some sort of hope that the future will change. So at this point, we can open it up to questions. Anyone who would like to? Yes.
Sorry, just before we start, we're going to start with a virtual question. And just because everybody hears differently, please wait for the mic to get to you before you ask your question. Okay? So we have here, if politics is self-serving for career and power, how can social movements take primary position in changing and making policy and legislation?
It's a great question. I think that abolition is fantastic, but you ask any abolitionist organization, it's not like we're going to close all the prisons tomorrow. So for where I'm standing, things like legislative policies, things like the legal slavery exemption ballot initiative that I mentioned earlier, to do as much as you can to stem the bleeding is incredibly important. This is going to be a long process. It's already been going on for a long time. And so to do anything you can to stem the bleeding is important to me. I started doing paralegal work recently for indigent defense. And so, yes, I'm participating in a system that I believe needs to be abolished and rethought. But I will do whatever I can in that system to stem the bleeding. And I feel that that's just another way of moving forward, is trying to find where the hemorrhaging is and do what you can to sort of, unfortunately, put a Band-Aid on it until something better comes along.
I guess I should stand up. Sure. Hello. Hi. So the public perceives the role of journalists to be unbiased, but as you already mentioned, every journalist and whatever they produce, there is some bias behind it. So in your opinion, how do you propose journalists alert their audience about these biases? Do you believe it should be implicit and allow the public to come to that decision, or do you believe it should be explicitly mentioned, like the goal of this, for example, your book, to uplift these voices, right?
So I don't think it's subtle now. I mean, it might not be written, but if you say you're an NBC guy, MSNBC guy, or a Fox News guy, like, we know what's going on. So I don't think it's necessary. I think what's important is to have I think what's important is to have skin in the game. So if people know that, like, I am writing about Black liberations movements, and I worked for Chesa Boudin, and I was part of a grassroots organization, they're going to know where I come from. So maybe just having some biographical data besides, like, Paula Lehman Ewing is a freelance writer. It's like, if we put something a little bit more about, like, our experience, I think that would be telling. But I also think that it's important that you talk to people who disagree with you. When I was a criminal justice reporter, obviously I had, progressive ideas. My editor was uber conservative, and we never had a problem, because she had never had a problem with any of my articles, because it was I just said how it was. And so that's one thing I think that you can do, is just kind of say how it was. The same thing with, when I talked to Killer Mike, maybe my questions about capitalism kind of would show how he and I think differently. But, like, is it surprised that, like, a Black rapper from Atlanta in a Jewish chick from New York think differently? Like, I don't like, you know, it's just, I think a lot of it is already out there, and you just do the best you can to talk to people who think differently and ask them questions.
Thank you. Hi, this is really inspiring. I've been really getting into like the idea of solutions journalism, and would you define what you're doing here as falling into that category? And if not, why not? And sort of a second part to that is, do you think, speaking to hope and giving our readers and viewers hope, because it's so much doom and gloom all the time, is solutions journalism a way to, because that's like focused on community work and what communities are doing with the problems that we have, is that a way to maybe give, the readership hope again, and maybe want to not just scroll past the news, but actually read it and ingest it?
I can speak to this for a moment. I think it's important to give readers the option to take agency. And if you're only focusing on a problem, but not showing anyone who's working on it, not showing any changes over time, that creates the issue you just named, where it's doom and gloom all the time. And when you're focusing on a problem, but maybe showing, here's a community organization that acknowledges this problem, and they're seeking funding to do some grassroots organizing around it, or they've been coming together for several years and actually hear how things have changed. That shows readers that they can take agency, whether on a small local issue or on the large scale. So it's focusing on solutions, recognizing that solutions are incremental, and giving readers the opportunity to make changes, which I think is really essential. And I would consider that a form of solutions journalism.
So I would argue that that journalists are not obliged to provide hope or solutions. That being said, if what comes out of a conversation with a real person is a solution and some hope, then that's fantastic. I think that if you want to, there's plenty of hope out there because there's plenty of humanity out there. So if you focus your story on people, the people who are living it, the people who are doing it, people are going to relate to that story. I mean, that's why social media is so big, right? Because we all participate in each other's imaginary lives online. But I think human connection is something that people really yearn for. And so they're going to not glaze over the news because they connect with people. I think that you see someone, I think that if you go beyond the press release and beyond someone like a politician who has, kind of a practiced approach to deal with reporters, and you just talk to a person who's out there doing the work, you're going to get a more interesting story. You will probably get a solution or two, and you'll provide insight that people are interested in because it's another person. It's another person who's real and who's doing the work. So that's what I would say.
I think this is kind of connected to the objectivity question, but do you have advice for journalists who are interested in covering social movements and maybe interested in covering, things like prison abolition, where to be able to do that reporting meaningfully, like you said, you realistically need skin in the game, but where we're also kind of balancing an industry where, depending on the publication you write for, the editors you work with, there's a capacity or a chance that you could be punished for that, having that involvement and having maybe vocal political convictions. I feel like we're all kind of witnessing that right now with Gaza. We're witnessing it, or we witnessed it in years past with BLM, even with sexual violence and Me Too. There's sort of a pattern of sometimes depending on your identity, maybe it's not permissible to allow you to speak. How do you navigate that?
That's a great question. So journalism ain't easy, especially for female reporters. I'll just say that, especially for reporters of color. I think that if you're working for a publication that isn't going to allow you to speak freely, you're probably working for the wrong publication. I worked for a lot of wrong publications, and I struck out on my own and wrote a book instead. I think that you need to have skin in the game. I also think that especially when it comes to mass incarceration and prison abolition or issues like Palestine, you can't have a neutral stance. Like, as a human operating in society, like, you can't be neutral about certain forms of oppression because A, that's inhumane, and B, it contributes to, the oppression. But for me, I can have very concrete opinions about controversial issues without necessarily prescribing an answer to them. And I think that's where the change is that, like, I can say I am anti-genocide, I am anti-terrorist. I don't find those two things in conflict with each other. But as a journalist, I'm going to look at the young activists in Palestine and Israel to see what they have to say about a solution, because I'm not there, and I believe that they have the most powerful perspective. And so I would say that if you're a journalist operating in a world of opinions, that I wouldn't try to hide them. I wouldn't try to not have them. I would focus on what your values are and what your beliefs are, but know in terms of prescribing and answers that we still have a long way to go, and that will really help your reporting, is to ask those questions.
What was the process like of actually writing this book, the timeline? I'm sure you had so many different interviews over the course of this process. Just like, what was like the general timeline?
Sure. How long does it take to write a book?
What was your timeline? I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
So I will say that, so I started writing the book at All of Us or None, which, so that was, I started it with a Kickstarter because I knew to write a book I would need to do it as a full-time job, and I had a child. So I did a Kickstarter to help me get started. I worked for 6 more months. But I will say, and I don't think you're gonna have this problem, that I got pregnant. And so I was very sick with my child. She is fine, she is beautiful, and she is a revolutionary, which is a problem for the authority figure in her life. But I'm not gonna try to parent her out of it. So I had a lot of time. I worked on the book pretty consistently for the next 2 years. The editing process, publishing process, was totally foreign to me, still kind of is. And to get the book to Shayna, it had to be done a year before it was going to publish. I did not know why, but it made sense once I started going through the process, because Shayna and I went through an editing process, and then I went through another editing process, and then went through a production process, got permissions from all the artists. I started getting endorsements, and actually a really interesting part of that process, and I'm really fortunate that NAB published this, because Victoria Law is one of my endorsers, and she said, I would love to endorse this book, but I have a big problem with the Atlanta chapter. And we kind of talked about Cop City and what's going on there, and I made a revision, and NAB let me put in a revision. And so that process was really interesting. We had a sensitivity reader, because Shayna and I acknowledged that we're both white women, and I wanted someone who was Black to read the book. So that was an interesting process. So that whole process took a year. Writing the book took 2, but again, I had some I had some downtime when I was like waddling up to interviews. But so yeah, that's what it was like for me. Mm-hmm. Don't get pregnant.
Hi. So as someone who's very interested in reporting on marginalized and/or oppressed groups of people, as someone who is a woman, is white presenting, of course, and I know you mentioned that having an approach of learning, and also listening is one approach. Having skin in the game is one. What are other practical ways or any advice you'd give to someone who's also a woman, who's also white presenting in a way, going into these groups and doing this reporting with care and doing them justice? Yeah.
My first advice would be to go into the groups. All these organizations have monthly meetings. They're usually membership meetings. Some of them are virtual. They're constantly holding panels. And I would go to those with open ears. I would talk to people afterwards about who you should be reading. I got my revolutionary education from Ken Oliver, who is formerly incarcerated and read every book on the shelf when he was in the Pelican Bay Shoe, because that's what he had lots of time. And so I would find out who you should be reading, do some research on your own about kind of what's out there, but be in there, just be in the rooms. I think for me, it was important for me to just be in the room and to not necessarily say, well, not necessarily, I just didn't say anything. Just to be there to listen, to know that they have someone who's willing to listen to them rather than talk at them, I think goes a long way. People just want to be heard. And so that would be my suggestion is, if you're covering a community, see what sort of community meetings they have, see where they get together, when they get together, and then just be there.
So thank you all so much for coming and listening today. I really encourage all of you to pick up a copy of Reimagining the Revolution. So many really important ideas represented in this book. Paula, I'm so happy to have been able to speak with you after working with you. Thank you.
Thank you for taking a chance on me.
It was a pleasure.
Oh.